Hello everyone, this is a video about Preservation Evokers. Preservation Evokers are different, interesting, challenging, and yet hardly anyone is playing them. Why is that? What's wrong with the specialization, and why is it almost completely absent from the current Mythic Plus healer meta? Let's look first at the current representation of different specializations in high-end Mythic Plus dungeons. As you can see from this graphic, the dark green bar for Preservation Evokers is essentially absent. Now, some people argue that this representation chart is a measure of preference, not a measure of power. However, from the extreme swings of spec representation over only a short time period, I believe that it is very evident that this graphic does not represent preference at all. If it did, where are all the protection paladins from a few weeks ago? Where are the augmentation evokers? And what is suddenly so fun about unholy decay when previously all DKs preferred playing frost? Right, it's their power. So perhaps it is a representation of player preference after all, but that's just because players prefer power. At the very least, we see a representation of perceived power, which may not map perfectly onto actual power, but it should be a very good proxy. So, where are the Preservation Evokers? This video discusses the many problems that Preservation Evokers have, which effectively preclude them from appearing on this chart. After that, I will present potential changes that could be made to the spec to address some of these problems. To begin, as I do when evaluating my students, let's build a little bit of a feedback sandwich, shall we? Starting by talking about what Preservation Evokers actually do well. And there are a couple of things that the spec does really well. First, Preservation Evokers have a number of medium strength burst healing cooldowns which they can use to heal cyclical damage rather well, cycling through Spirit Bloom, Fire Breath, its associated Lifespark procs, Dream Breath, as well as Echo and Lifebind, enables Preservation Evokers to reliably heal recurring burst damage. Add to that the power of Stasis, Communion, and Rewind as an emergency heal, and you have a specialization that is very capable of healing bursty encounters, such as the Paladins from the Priory of the Sacred Flame. Second, Preservation Evokers are quite capable of healing individual targets that are taking a lot of damage by using the Echo Reversion combo for the Golden Hour effect, as well as using Echo Verdant Embrace. Golden Hour is especially powerful because it scales with damage taken, therefore healing more in higher key levels, which is a scaling effect that few other healers can rely on. This kind of healing comes in handy in encounters like the first boss in Cinderbrew Meadery, or the last boss in Operation Floodgate. In these fights, selected targets take high amounts of damage, and Evoker's spot healing can be rather good, especially when further augmented with time dilation. Finally, Preservation Evokers have rather good self-sustain, with 2 charges of Obsidian Scales and Renewing Blaze, and the ability to also apply the aforementioned spot healing rotation to themselves. However, Preservation Evokers have to deal with a lot of disadvantages that significantly diminish their power. Let's address the elephant in the room first, the restricted range. With only 30 yards of effective healing range, the spec can feel very frustrating to play, especially when pugging in random groups where other players may not be aware of those limitations or simply do not want to alter their playstyle to suit you. This becomes particularly apparent during the final boss in the Rookery, where I have had many situations in which I was soaking a pillar and none of my teammates were in healing range. Beyond the actual decrease in power that this brings with it, it is just extremely frustrating to play and certainly discourages players from picking up the specialization. The second disadvantage is associated with Verdant Embrace. Essentially, you must use Verdant Embrace only on yourself, for if you use it on someone else, your character will be displaced and you may get one-shot. You fly, you die. While it is theoretically possible to plan out your Verdant Embraces perfectly through outstanding encounter knowledge and positional awareness, hardly anyone is actually capable of perfectly evaluating the positioning of their teammates at all times. If you ever accidentally use Verdant Embrace on the wrong target at the wrong time, chances are you will die immediately. Third, as a Preservation Evoker, your large group heals require a lot of setup time. usually needing 3 globals to cast echoes on your teammates before consuming the echoes with Verdant Embrace, applying Lifebind to your teammates, and then casting an AoE healing spell of your choosing, for example Spirit Bloom or Dream Breath, within the Lifebind window. First of all, using 3 globals in which you do essentially nothing does not feel super satisfying, but the problem runs deeper than that. While you are preparing the setup, so applying the echoes, your ability to react to incoming damage is severely restricted. Say, the tank suddenly drops low and requires healing after you have placed 2 of the 3 echoes. You may want to use Verdant Embrace or Reversion on top of to top him off before the AoE damage hits for which you have been preparing. However, doing so will immediately consume the echoes which you have set up, destroying your healing setup for the upcoming AoE event and thereby severely restricting your ability to heal through it. While time dilation can help out a little bit in these situations, it is a far cry from solving the problem. Number 4. You actually run out of mana. As a priest, I have healed the Swamp Phase encounter for extended durations, feeling that I could essentially keep going indefinitely. While as a Preservation Evoker, I will absolutely run out of mana at some point. Now, I spec into Energy Loop and could use Disintegrate to regenerate mana, but Disintegrate costs Essence, which, as it just so happens, is the very resource I need to echo my teammates and heal rot encounters such as Swamp Phase. Thus, I cannot effectively regenerate mana in healing-intensive environments. Number 5. The raid buff of Evokers is terrible. You will never get invited into a group because of a 15% cooldown reduction on a movement ability, which provides no increase to any measurable performance metric. I would stipulate that even 50% cooldown reduction would still not be sufficient to make this buff desirable in dungeons, even though that would be a bit of a meme and I'm certainly not advocating for a 50% CDR. Finally, with all the different combos, setups, range restrictions and requirements for positional awareness, the spec is hard to master, which in itself is not a bad thing, but even if you do all of these things right, your output is still lacking significantly behind other specializations. Quickly looking at the top HPS of different specializations in a high-key environment, we can see that Priest, Mistweaver, Druid break 2 million HPS. Resto Shamans come in at a maximum of 1.9 million, Paladins at 1.6 million, and Preservation Evokers slot in around the same value at around 1.6 million. This is problematic because Preservation Evoker is a throughput-only healer, offering no damage mitigation tools outside of time dilation and rescue. In conclusion, Preservation Evoker is hamstrung by a number of restrictions, but there seems to be no redeeming quality to justify them. We will now look at potential ways to improve Preservation Evokers in order to make them more viable in a dungeon healing environment. I brainstormed these suggestions myself, but that does not mean that I was the one who originally came up with them, nor do I claim intellectual ownership of these ideas. We begin by discussing suggestions that I call reasonable requests, which would be fairly simple to implement and offer a moderate power gain. And then we're going to look at some more outlandish suggestions from the cookbook. Let's start with the reasonable requests. First, make Verdant Embrace a choice node where players can choose between Verdant Embrace as it is now and a new talent, which applies the healing effect of Verdant Embrace but does not displace your character. It would be called Verdant Apparition and let an animated Dracthir fly toward your target, healing them on impact. This would offer a moderate to large power gain to Preservation Evokers, enabling them to use one of their core rotational abilities without constantly being at the risk of dying. Second, reduce or remove the essence costs of Disintegrate for Preservation Evokers to allow them to regenerate mana in healing-intensive environments. Currently, mana regeneration comes at the expense of being able to cast Echo, significantly reducing throughput and interfering with a smooth rotation. Given that other healers are also designed in such a way that they barely lose any mana during healing-intensive fights, this seems like a fair request to make Evokers slightly more competitive. Third, give Evokers a meaningful raid buff. 15% cooldown reduction on a movement ability is simply not something that players care about, and nor should they, as it offers no significant performance enhancement. However, adding 2 or 3% haste to Evoker's raid buff would go a long way in improving their power from a group building perspective. Now for the more cookbook side of changes, which are likely not going to get implemented but could offer Evokers a much needed power gain. First, extend the effective healing range. Apart from class fantasy, there is no convincing reason why Evokers should have a low range without any apparent upside, and the mobility really isn't that much of an upside. A range extension would still require Evokers to be in the action to aim and target Dream Breath and Fire Breath, so a more close-up playstyle would be maintained even if the maximum range of almost all other abilities was 40 yards. At this point, the restrictions just seem arbitrary, especially when Blizzard designs encounters like the Rookery End Boss with comically large arenas, which additionally require your team to be spread out. In organized groups, the limited range may be less of an issue, but in pugs it's very frustrating to deal with and prevents players from picking up or enjoying the specialization. A band-aid fix to this problem might also be to reduce the cooldown of Spatial Paradox down to 1 minute, because a 3-minute cooldown on a capstone talent that essentially does nothing other than making you feel like any other healer for a couple of seconds seems pointlessly high. Second, allow Preservation Evokers to cast empowered spells while moving. This would be very strong. However, priests too can effectively do this already when casting Penance as their main healing ability while moving. So why should Evokers not enjoy a similar benefit, especially considering their many drawbacks? Third, and finally, and probably from the overcooked category, allow Dream Breath overhealing to accumulate as a shield, which might be limited by a certain maximum value. This would allow Preservation Evokers to not only be a throughput healer, but could also contribute to the group's effective HP. In its current state, Preservation Evokers seem to have several relatively arbitrary restrictions without any apparent upside. I think if Blizzard does not want the specialization to completely disappear, some change is needed. I'm not advocating for all of these changes in the video to be implemented, but I wanted to offer a reasonable starting point for discussion. If you found this video interesting, entertaining, or otherwise stimulating, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, or share your own ideas of how Preservation Evokers could be improved. If you hated every second of it and are just waiting to rage at me in the comments, bring it on. I'm ready for a fight. Thanks everyone for watching, and see ya.